Welcome to the third of four sessions of the Meet the Author series. It's December 15th, 2020, and we are live on Facebook and YouTube. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm your host, John Saunders, author and coach at New Degree Press. If you ever dreamed of writing a book, what it really takes to get it done, if you want to hear the real journey, all three of us tonight have just survived that journey to publishing, and you've come to the right place. Daphne and I just finished our first book, and Jen her second. Hard to believe. Books are without a doubt a creative and often exhaustive journey, but highly rewarding. And I can attest, authoring a book is an extraordinary distraction from years like 2020. You get to create something, meet so many new people. Along the way, as you research and conduct interviews for your book, and at the end, you get to share your story with the world. What could be better? Let there be no doubt, writing a book is far from a linear path and can get really messy in our busy lives. But for the next 60 minutes, we're going to offer you a front row seat to what exactly this journey looks like, provide you insights into what we wish we had known before we began writing these books, and the key lessons we've learned as we moved along through the journey ourselves. Think about this. Less than 2% of people that start writing books actually get them published. It's a big task, no doubt about it. What you're going to hear tonight are incredible stories about community, learning, resilience, all in the middle of a global pandemic, and creating something that's your very own through this extraordinary time period. We found a way to overcome what seems to be the impossible. And we spent the last year in this journey. And this week, all of our books were published. Couldn't be more excited about it. So tonight, along with myself, we have two extraordinary authors and executive coaches who've built exceptional businesses, helping clients, building their businesses, and growing their leadership skills. And we all saw the book journey as a fantastic opportunity to upskill ourselves and find a better way to help share our stories with the world and help the world become a better place as well. Our special guest here tonight, our first-time author, Daphne Jefferson, principal and executive coach at Jefferson Consulting, and second-time author, Jen Dalton, CEO and founder of Brand Mirror. Daphne, Jen, welcome and congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Such a pleasure to be here. So let's get right into the questions. We'll have, as I said, about 60 minutes. We'll save the last 15 or so for Q&A. So Jen, let's start with you. Could you just give us a little bit more insight into the journey? Into yourself, and a little bit about why this book? Why did you want to get this story out there?
Sure, absolutely. So I'm a personal brand strategist. And actually, John, if you want to move your camera up, I want to make sure we can see you too, just a little bit more.
Oh, sorry.
There we go. Perfect. So I'm a personal brand strategist, and my focus has always been on how to be authentic. And in 2018, when we had political season and politics, it's hard to actually sometimes be authentic because you kind of want to be quiet. And I remember my husband and I, we were sitting around having a lazy day, which doesn't happen often. So I was very excited about it. And he said something off the cuff, and I remember wanting to jump out of my seat. And the reality is, that really doesn't make sense. It's my husband. He's not going to hurt me. We're on the same team. But I wanted to know, why did I overreact that way? And then fast forward to 2019. My mother passed away in April, early May that year. And the conversations that happen after you lose someone in your family, someone you're close to, if you've never had that happen, life does not prepare you for that. And so as I started to have conversations with other people who had gone through something similar, sharing those stories, giving a window into those conversations helps you not feel so alone. And practicing with them with other people also can help you navigate them a lot easier. And we tend to avoid difficult conversations. So this book really was an exploration for me on how do I become a better communicator? Who does this really well? And what are their best practices? And so I did that through interviews and compiling that story.
Wow. So it's a personal, really, and professional journey of growth. That's incredible. Daphne, I'd love to hear your version of that story. What was it that compelled you to write this book? Why did you want to do it?
Well, if you'd asked me 3 years ago, I would have told you, no, I will not be writing a book. People used to ask me about, sharing my experiences in writing. And I said, no, I'm not a writer. And then about a year ago, I met a coach who was on a panel, and she was saying, oh, my book's coming out. And I was telling her what a great thing that was. And, you know, it just seems so hard. And she said, I found a program. It's a 1-year process. And you go from idea to book in your hand in 1 year. She had me at 1 year process, get it done. And I was trying to figure out what I wanted to write about. And the thing that struck me most was my experience as a woman, and particularly as a woman of color and a leader, and sometimes being the only one. And so that loneliness and isolation, and not really finding people who look like me, thought like me, acted like me. And so one of the things that I wanted to do was to kind of put myself back as the 25-year-old, and what would I want to know? What would be helpful for me? And so that was the foundation of the stories and the things that I wrote about. And so it's been a journey from having a kernel of an idea, thinking I wanted to write about one thing, and really getting in touch with what was most important to me.
So another, certainly a personal link to the story, without a doubt. When you think about, you mentioned the word process and this whole journey, can you share with us, gosh, how do you even write a book? I mean, do you sit down and write it over the course of a couple of days? Do you write 15 minutes a day? Can you talk to us through a little bit more detail about the journey itself?
Well, as you both know, this is a process, and it takes some discipline. And the thing that helped me most is I found Eric Kester's Book Creator Institute. He's through the Georgetown program. And so having a process, template, schedule, accountability, which was really very important to me, to keep me on track. And so I work full time. I have a couple of different jobs, and I think we're all busy. And one of the things that I had to figure out was how to fit it into the rest of my life. And I found that what was helpful for me was to schedule my writing time every week, time on the calendar. Through Book Creators, I had an editor who was helping me to develop stories and ideas and putting those into chapters, and having templates and tools that, especially for a first-time writer, we don't know what we don't know. We jump in and think we're going to write the great American novel, and having somebody who's been there before and that can help us with the process and to understand what's a good story, what makes a compelling argument, and also the process of research and documentation, so that at the end of the day, you have a very sound piece of work that can support you and your career.
I heard a lot there about structure, about process, about scheduling time. And I suppose when you put it on your calendar right then, someone else can't book an appointment there for you. What a great idea. Jen, could you give us a little bit of a glimpse into how you went about it?
Sure. Because this is my second book, I would love to say all of it was easier. What I've learned from both times, the first time was, when I went to go write the book, and it was also part of a peer group. So I think, Daphne, that's a great point. Being a part of a peer group, so you commiserate together, but you also progress together, is huge. One of the things most people think they should do is write an outline. And, John, as you mentioned at the beginning, this is a creative process. And so for me, I actually don't write an outline. I try to figure out who is the reader of this book. They're going to read this book, and I want them to be different by the end of it. Therefore, what are the stories that I want to capture to make that possible? And then when I start writing, I try to start writing with what's the most compelling story that I'm most excited to write. That might be chapter 12. That might be chapter 1. It might be the intro. But just to start writing and getting that out is really important. That's how my first book went. I think once I did that, my second book, I went more in order by chapters, but outlining it and brainstorming it. There's definitely an order to do it in that doesn't destroy the creative process, but still gives you some structure so you can still innovate and not feel constrained.
I love that. And, one of the things about innovation and creativity, I think oftentimes one of the big learnings from my book was, in researching my book, was finding from a leader at Microsoft that putting constraints around innovation are something that really empowers it, right? If you go to someone and say, hey, here's a blank piece of paper, draw something, right? Where do they even begin? And especially when you think about a leadership employee relationship, right, with no guidance, chances are good they're going to come back with something that isn't going to be very useful to you, right? As opposed to saying, hey, draw a tree. Well, now creativity can begin, right? Or write a chapter or write a story or whatever the case might be. That's really interesting. I'll share that when I think about getting down to the nitty gritty of writing, I found, some people write in 15-minute increments. Some people sit down for an hour. Some people write early. Some people write late. I found my night owl lifestyle kicking in. Kind of took me back to my college years, I suppose, my undergrad years. I found for me, I needed extraordinary silence. It takes an incredible amount of concentration and energy to stay focused. And if there's a distraction in the background or something like that, completely lose my place. And then, there's so many complex moving parts to it. It would be very frustrating. So I found after my kids go to bed, 9 o'clock, that's when I would kick into high gear. Thank you for sharing those. So Jen, when you think about the story you wrote here, what is it, how is it you want your story to change people's thinking and their actions? How do we want to see people evolve from our stories? You want to start, Jen?
So it's really interesting from avoiding difficult conversations. You can go back to the 1800s and see etiquette books that say, don't talk about politics, don't talk about religion. I think that's part of the challenge with where we're at today, because we consistently avoid conversation, and we're wired to, right? Our brain is wired to survive and protect ourselves. So part of that avoiding confrontation is the brain kicking in saying, no, let's avoid this. It could get dangerous. But the reality is, if you take a deep breath, we really do need to be able to have difficult conversations. And the more we practice, the easier it is. And so when I think of leaders who had to talk to people virtually and coach them this year or let them go, when I think of families who have to talk to each other, avoiding these conversations just keeps the monkey on your back, and it doesn't actually solve the challenge. And whether you want to talk politics at Thanksgiving, that's a different thing, but we all are going to have some kind of conversation that's difficult. So one of the things when we write our books that is important is to think about how is it different from other books that are already out there. There are a lot of amazing communication books, but one of the things that I think makes my book unique is that every chapter is a different topic, and I do 2 deep dive interviews in each chapter. And so you get context about what's the before context going into the conversation, what happens during, and what happens after. And so when I think about staying calm and taking a deep breath, that's huge to disrupt reacting in anger or being annoyed. And one of my favorite quotes is, raise your words, not your voice. It is rain that grows flowers, not thunder, by Rumi. And so I think we all need to figure out, how do we stay calm and listen and then move forward? It doesn't mean we have to agree. It doesn't mean it all happens in one conversation, but we do need to start practicing those behaviors.
I mean, wow. Talk about some deep life lessons there that maybe sometimes we take for granted. Is there maybe one story from the book you think of that kind of takes that little nugget and brings it together?
That's like asking me about my favorite child. I love all my stories. And what I really love is that people were willing to share, because that really made a big difference. One of my favorite stories is from Diane Falk, and she shares how she had to have a conversation with her father about transitioning out of the home into a community. And in his mind, as the audience receiving the conversation, he had a very different perception of that conversation. And it was, I'm going someplace to die. And in her mind, it was, we need to take care of you. How can we do that? And so the depth that she shared about that dialogue, what she thought about, how she gave him space to come to that answer on his own, and just having a dialogue back and forth and not seeing him as a problem or an obstacle or a challenge, which, let's face it, when you get in a difficult conversation, you can easily see the other person as an opponent. And if you're going into a conversation and it feels that way, then it's time to step back, because that's not going to move anybody forward. So I think, of all of my stories that I love, I really do like hers, but all of the interviews have that depth. So even if you haven't gone through it, maybe it'll prepare you on the off chance that you're going to have that conversation.
Communication is so key, and boy, dealing with parents and putting them in a home, such a difficult circumstance. I appreciate you sharing that. Daphne, when you think about that question, when you think about your book and what you've brought to the world and this idea around dropping your mask, I love that theme. What is it you want to see? How do you want to see people change their actions and their thinking from your book?
I want to see people be able to embrace themselves, first of all, in all of their various identities. We all bring a lot of different pieces forward as we go, whether it be our families, our religion, where we grew up, how we grew up, our economic background, our gender, our sexual orientation. All of these things are a part of us. But for so long, we were told to leave all of that outside of work and just, separate and compartmentalize ourselves into these, as a friend of mine called it, we send our avatar into work. That is a representation, but is not really us. And so what I'm hoping that people will walk away with is that we are whole human beings, and good, bad, otherwise, and to embrace our differences and the things that make us unique, because really that's what diversity is all about. It's about different experiences and people bringing their different flavors and sauce. I like to cook, so it's really about bringing things to this gumbo that is the workplace that allows us to excel. And so one of the things that I talk about in the book is really about this idea of being like someone. What's the definition of a great leader? And for too long, a definition of a great leader has been a middle-aged white guy. And for people like me, that I just did not relate to that. And my style is not like that. How I carry myself, how I interact with people is different. Doesn't mean it's good or bad. I can be just as effective. I think I was effective being who I was. But people have these ideas of what leadership looks like. And one of the stories I tell in the book is about a boss of mine who was really denigrating me because she said I was too nice, as though treating people with respect and having a team that supported you and would, I had a team that would, tear down walls for me just because they knew I would do the same thing for them. But the way I spoke to them, she thought it was too nice and they needed to be afraid of me. And that lesson for me was that who you are has to match where you are. And when it doesn't, I think that's when problems occur. And to be able to recognize that sometimes who you are is not right for the place that you're in. And you don't, and there's a woman, Carolyn Wanga, who was the chief diversity officer at Target. She has a great expression. And she said, basically, when who you are doesn't work for where you are, you change where you are, not who you are. And that's what I want people to take away from the book, is that we embrace who we are and understand what that means and find places where we can thrive.
I love that. Embrace yourself, be who you are, where you are. Don't change for others. I mean, there's a massive job market out there, isn't there? And we all should be in a situation where we're respected and feel valued. Thanks for sharing that story. Moving on here, Daphne, when you think about the research you did and all the people you talked to throughout this book journey, can you think of your favorite transformative experience in your life that really created a story or lesson in your book? Well,
I talk a little bit about growing up as a little kid and learning from my parents and my grandparents. My grandparents were always around, and we were a relatively small family, but very close knit. And I was always curious as a little kid, and I would, my parents and grandparents and their friends played cards on Monday night. And so I would go to bed, but I'd sneak up just to listen to the conversations and to hear the grown-up conversations. But I learned a lot from my family, and I take that into leadership. It's how you treat people, respect. knowing your stuff, being prepared every day, showing up looking like you were meant to be the boss and not the person who is, just struggling to get a job. And the communication skills, the preparedness, and all of those things, and just who I was and where I came from and whose shoulders I was standing on was really, really clear to me. And so being able to reflect on that and talk a little bit about that in the context of, all of these great leadership theories, my core theories came from home. And that's how I learned to be who I am.
That's fantastic. And thinking about, just how those lessons when you were a kid and how your family interacted with you and how you were able to carry that forward, that's just fantastic. Jen, what is your favorite story when you think about that in terms of a transformative moment in your life that helped you bring some of these stories in this book to life?
Well, I think, as I mentioned earlier, and just exploring that a little bit more, when we think about going through our life in difficult conversations, it's important to be authentic. And I found myself in conversations where I could either be quiet and not share my view and probably keep the peace, or when the goal was for the broader relationship to be healthier, not for the sake of me saying something, but because it should be able to be said, then being able to have a difficult conversation is really about being yourself. If you're transgender and you can't be yourself because you haven't come out, because you haven't been able to have that difficult conversation because you're scared or worried, you cannot authentically be yourself. If you're, one of the chapters is about that. One of the chapters is about, estranged family members. Our relationships, and especially the relationships with people we care about, those are the ones that hopefully can be grounded in trust. And because you know each other, hopefully you like each other for the most part, and you trust each other enough to say, I may not get this right. I care about you. I really would like to discuss something with you and share it, right? There's a way to go into a conversation like that. And so when I had conversations with family members after my mom passed, I had to remember that they weren't trying to hurt me. They were also hurting. And just because we were getting through the conversation in a little bit of a messy way, or it didn't feel great, that didn't mean we should avoid it. And as a personal brand strategist, being authentic is core to everything I do and everything I coach people on. And just as Daphne said, being able to embrace who you are and be yourself all the time is really important. And if we hold ourselves back and don't share what we observe, see, how we feel, what matters, that really doesn't do justice to any of us.
It's so important. I heard a lot of great themes here. Embrace yourself, be vulnerable, be authentic, be yourself in every aspect of your world. Given that you both work in and around leadership coaching, love to hear your thoughts on how you've seen that help leaders grow in their roles. You want to take that one, Daphne?
Sure. I think the best leaders are the best versions of themselves every day. I'm not going to say that they're perfect. There's no such thing. But you know who they are and what they stand for and how they lead. And it comes across as authentic because it's from their experience. And I think what I take away is people who are trying to be something other than who they genuinely, authentically are, spend a tremendous amount of their energy and their capital in keeping up this mask or this appearance. And so they're never going to be able to bring their best forward because they're so busy trying to keep up a pretense for fear. And in some instances is because if they show up as who they feel they authentically are, they will not be accepted. And that's a lot of weight to put on people. And some of the research that I did in my book, it talks about this emotional tax that women, particularly women of color and people who find themselves as the onlys in an organization or in a leadership realm, have to pay. It's on your health. It's on your well-being. It's a physical toll that it takes in being someone other than who you are. And so as leaders, in order to be our most effective, we have to connect with who we're supposed to be and how we are showing up in the world and letting go of trying to be somebody else. I think in the first chapter of the book, I talk about people trying to be Oprah Winfrey. Everyone would love to be Oprah, but there's only one. That job's taken. The rest of us have to figure out who we're supposed to be in this world and be the best at that.
I love that. And, you think about this authenticity, this vulnerability, and I know I keep going back to this, but I think for so many years, and I think our culture has convinced us that that's not the way to go. We have to put this, I love your title, mask, dropping the mask. Like we have to put this mask out there to be this person that we're not really, to make things go. And I think it couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, I think putting yourself out there is a sign of strength, even though you're exposing yourself, right, and being vulnerable. Whereas for so long, it's been seen as a weakness. And I think that's just, it's a change that I think we all need to make. And I think your book really speaks to that. Jen, anything you'd add to that story in terms of leadership and how you've seen people change?
I think the only thing I would add is this year has been a crucible year. And what I mean by that is just you really grow most when you're under pressure, right? Success is the worst teacher. And so when it comes to dropping the mask or when it comes to embracing a difficult conversation, it's really about being able to not be afraid of that and understand. For me, it was just understanding my brain's going to run off, like the amygdala is going to hijack me and I'm going to feel attacked. But it's important to step back, know how your body works so you can take a deep breath and really think about what is the other person's perspective? What are their experiences? I mean, to Daphne's point, everyone has diverse experiences. You don't know what they are until you ask. And it's, when we go into a conversation, we go in with just our information. But in any conversation or just being yourself, it's important to appreciate and respect other people's perspective, even if you disagree. Because there's billions of more perspectives, right, literally, than just your own, because everyone brings their own experiences to the table. And that in leadership can be really fabulous. And in difficult conversations, it can be also challenging. And in both situations, it can be challenging. So I think this year leaders had to figure out and get comfortable being more vulnerable. I don't know that everybody's done it, but it's been a forcing mechanism, a forcing function this year to do that. I mean, think about it. We're all virtual. As a leader in a virtual space, you have to have conversations now that sometimes you might have had at the water cooler, but now you have to schedule it. It doesn't feel the same. They could be really hard. You don't have someone in the room, so it's, two-dimensional conversation. So yes, I think this year has forced a lot of people to have difficult conversations. And I think it's also forced a lot of leaders to figure out, who am I as a leader? And how do I keep this organization moving forward under such stress?
It's such an interesting point. And, there's been this debate, are we going to go back to all being in offices again or, stay virtual to some degree? How's this going to play out? And you think about this, and what I've seen for most people within my network is not only, I think people want to not go back to work because I think leaders and managers are saying, oh my gosh, now that you don't have to commute and anything, we sort of get to two extra hours of productivity in our days. And oh, by the way, no breaks because you're scheduled, from dawn to sunset. I'd love to hear, Daphne, if you maybe have a story about how you've sort of helped some coaches coach some clients through maybe some of these experiences in 2020, because it has been such a challenging year for so many of us. If you have a thought around that.
It has been, and a lot of my clients are struggling with this idea of building relationships when you are no longer present, especially in cultures where the norm is that people are in the office. The idea of the water cooler is a real thing. You can get a whole lot done between your desk and the water cooler or the restroom. And so a lot of my clients, especially the introverts, it's really, really difficult because that idea of reaching out, especially if you're relatively new to the organization, if you came into an organization in January or February and you're virtual in March, you didn't really have a chance to get acclimated and get to know people. And so I've been recommending 15-minute coffee breaks, coffee meetings, short, relatively short. They're scheduled, but it gives people an opportunity to reach out to other people that they haven't had a chance to interact with, or to at least start to build some relationships in a non-threatening way. It's not with an agenda. It's, how can I support you? Just want to get to know you. Are there things that you'd like for me to know? And it's just starting those icebreakers in 15 or 20-minute chunks that allow people to start reconnecting in ways that they maybe haven't been able to do since February or March.
You're muted, John.
You're muted, John.
I didn't do it.
Finding ways to connect in this bizarre world we live in. Thank you for the heads up there. It is certainly a challenge. So I love that very practical, actionable advice, Daphne. Jen, before we sort of roll to our last segment of questions in the Q&A, anything you'd add to that story with sort of how you've evolved your coaching this year?
A lot of my work was already virtual. And so what wasn't necessarily virtual was doing speaking.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think to Daphne's point, really thinking through what's the purpose of the gathering we're having? What's the purpose of the meeting? So Priya Parker's book on the art of gathering, really thinking through, why are we having this meeting, get together? How are people going to be better for it? So this idea of reassessing your formal and informal communications. Which meetings do you need to have? And just because they were an hour before, do they need to be in virtual? Like maybe they should just be 30 minutes or 20 minutes or a phone call. So I think it's important. Now's a really good time to reassess the mix of formal versus informal, because the informal is so, it has to be scheduled now. It's like you almost have to make the informal a little more formal just to make it happen. And I also think if people are in meetings all day, they don't get to relax. They don't get to connect. And I think Daphne's, spot on around building relationships is what makes us feel connected, builds trust, which helps us do our job better. Mm-hmm. And so that's where, the difficult conversations need to happen. They can only actually happen if you have trust with someone. So that's why these informal meetings that are scheduled and sort of formal have to happen. So you can keep that trust, to keep collaboration and creativity going. One of the things that I think is really important is when we're under stress, we cannot be creative or collaborative. It is very hard. Mm-hmm. And I don't mean stress like I've got a deadline. I mean stress where we don't feel safe. We're worried about our job. We're worried about everything. We're worried about our family. And this year, there's no wall between our lives. Like we're at home and at work in the same place. So all of that's smushed together. So from an identity standpoint, it's even more important to be authentic and really think about, how do I want to show up and how can I help my team members? As a leader, how can you help support folks on your team? Because they're all going through the same stress. And that's where that, informal piece and really just listening and checking in on people is huge right now.
I love that you use the word trust. And so much of, I think, leadership is anchored in trust. And trust isn't there, you're just not going to get very far. And in an environment where it's so difficult I think so much more difficult to read body language. I love this concept of scheduling these sort of informal meetings throughout the day to just make sure you're checking in and seeing how people are doing. Because to, I think, Daphne's point earlier, we all sort of deal with stress differently. And, what more bizarre, stressful year we had in 2020, where we're all work, home, life, everything has just sort of been mushed into one thing. And, it's hard to find a break. So I love that kind of planning time for this connection. I think that's brilliant.
Well, and I want to make sure we don't miss your book. So, in your book, The Optimizer, you talk about having transparent conversations and asking for input and bringing people together to share what's working, what's not. So I would love for you to share a little bit about that too, because I think that's also relevant to informal meetings, but also right? Or places where you give people space to feel valued and contribute.
Yeah, I appreciate that. You know, it was interesting when I first became a leader. I really spent a lot of time. Let me back up a hair. When I was out in the field as a salesperson, I remember at some point my business started out very good. I was down in Florida, went up, had a great run for 5 or 6 years, won an award, maybe 2, and then my business started to plateau. And the whole time that was plateauing, I kept sort of looking over my shoulder at this award on my shelf and thinking, oh, well, you know, must be something that's not me because I got this award over here, right? And I'll never forget going to this meeting, the award ceremony at the end of the year, some big hotel conference room somewhere. And they announced the award I could have won. And I realized up until that very moment, I was deluding myself to think I had a chance. And they announced the person's name and I realized, wow, I wasn't even in the running. And the gentleman that won the big award that year, I ran right up to him afterwards. Ian is his name, great guy. We're still friends to this day. This was 10, 11 years ago. And I said, Ian, did you do something different this year to change your business? Because you just had this blowout year in sales. And he said, yes, I went and surveyed my best clients and asked them what it's like working with me. And, you know, what's it like working with me? How could I improve my process? How could I be a better partner to you? And I thought, wow, I mean, no one was talking about this in 2010 or 11, at least not in my little circle of folks back then. So I took that survey, went out, did the same thing myself, and literally just had the exact same result he did in the following year where I won that big award. And fast forward, was able to parlay that into a leadership position. And then I took that same model of asking this sort of feedback loop and brought that to my team as a leader. And I have to tell you, it's a very challenging thing to get started. You know, you both talked about trust and being authentic. And if people don't trust you and think you're authentic, you ask them, what's it like working with you, or what's good about working with you, what's not. That's not a question people are ready to answer all the time. And I can tell you, once we finally had a sort of a breakthrough, until we had that breakthrough, it was very difficult to have those conversations. Not that it was, I wouldn't say painful, but I just wasn't getting much from them. And the brief story on the breakthrough was, I asked one guy on my team, you know, we were a remote team, how can we improve communication? And he said, we have way too many conference calls. This gentleman, Brian Stein, great guy, still talk to him to this day. And this was 6, 7 years ago. And I said, you know, let's just sort of knock out a bunch of our calls this year around the holidays, things like that, instead of pushing them a day or two. And then I took that information, sent a note to my team, said, hey, this guy thinks we have too many calls. We're going to try it this year, fewer calls, see what happens. And so I asked for his advice. I took action on it. I gave him credit for it. And that was such a breakthrough moment where people said, you know what, he's asking us for feedback, and he's going to actually do something with it if we come to him with a good idea. And that was such a breakthrough moment of building trust and really getting the team moving in the right direction. So thank you for asking that.
Well, I think one of the themes that weaves through all 3 of our books is self-reflection. Mm-hmm. You really have to think about who you are, what you want, what have you contributed to the current situation, so what might you need to change. The same is true with a conversation, right? I have to really think about, why am I having a conversation? I was in a meeting the other day and someone said, hey, would you go talk to somebody about this? And I paused. Thank goodness I wrote this book. I paused and I said, wait a minute. Are you making me the messenger? Because I don't want to be the messenger. Like, messengers get shot. I know what happens in that story. If you want me to make a dialogue, then let's turn this monologue message into a dialogue. And here's how we can think about that. But do not go fall for the messenger thing. And just because you're a nice person, go tell somebody else what someone else wants you to tell them, because it's a hard message to deliver. No. So I think that self-reflection piece, where you really try to understand, where are you at? What are your options? And how do you become more authentic through that process, is huge. And I love that you went out and asked for feedback, because most people don't ever want to do that. But that's a critical part of knowing, how are you showing up?
I'll tell you, there were some brutal answers to those questions that you did not want to hear. But you said it earlier, you know, these difficult conversations, it's how you grow. And if you're doing something that someone doesn't appreciate or find of value, and they don't ever tell you, or you never unearth that, you're never going to find out. And I think as a leader, it's incumbent upon you to start that conversation, because I don't think an employee is going to come and start that.
That's
totally agree.
And that's the essence of what coaching is all about. It really is about that self-reflection. First, you have to be aware of what you're doing, because there's so much of our behavior that's below the surface. It's unconscious. And until you can notice, become aware, and have a choice about what you want to do about it. And the same is true with asking people for feedback. Sometimes we ask for feedback. We really don't want feedback. We want them to tell us how wonderful we are. And the hard part is to really figure out what we need to do differently and how to build a different set of habits. Because under pressure, we all revert back to whoever or whatever we were before, unless we've built a new set of habits, building new neural pathways and getting fully engaged in changing. And that process of change for leaders can be a very powerful way to build trust, because it means that you're listening and you're paying attention and you care. Because when you get that feedback, it's really important how you respond. If you respond with reflection and thinking about it, processing it, and being willing to make a change, that speaks volumes for who you could be as a leader. And people will support you 100%. But if they provide that feedback and you reject it or try to make it less about you and more about them, then you've probably lost that trust. And so it's really critical in how you handle those difficult conversations and what you do with the information you get.
I would add one wrinkle to that thought, Daphne. I love that, but also not doing anything with that information, right? So there's the negative reaction, there's the positive reaction, and there's the no reaction, which may be even worse, right? Because now this person, your employee maybe, has put themselves out there and nothing becomes of it. And that can really be a frustrating circumstance as well. Should we move to our last question here before we open it up to the audience?
Sounds good.
Yeah.
How about we go to you, Jen? What's your one big key piece of advice you'd love to share with the group?
I think it's very important to remember in a conversation, and I said this earlier, why do you need to have the conversation on what's going on? And when you go into the conversation, whether it's a surprise conversation or not, it's important to remember that the person you're speaking with is not an obstacle. They're a human, right? And you may feel like going into a difficult conversation, they're making this hard, they've done something, blah, blah, blah. But it's really important to keep in mind that they're a person too, they're human too. And the best thing you might do in a conversation is just listen, right? You don't have to go in necessarily with answers. Maybe they're just venting. And so I talk about that framework of where are you in a conversation? And I think going in and remembering they're a person, always default to listen and ask questions, because asking questions can disrupt their brain and engage their prefrontal cortex where they then can't freak out. They have to de-escalate a little bit. And so just understanding some of that chemistry really helps you name what's going on and then be able to respond and feel like you at least can recognize when you're escalating and then make sure you de-escalate. So I know that was more than one, but those things all play a role to help us stay as calm as possible and as collaborative as possible. And remember, you can always press pause, right? You don't have to see a conversation all the way through. So I would say go read the book, because there's a lot in it. It's not an easy topic, much like Daphne's book and your book. I mean, we spent a whole year researching and writing, and sometimes longer researching, and we just started writing this year. So there are a lot of good insights that I think, because we did it in a storytelling form, makes it really easy to read and comprehend.
Yeah, so it's stories that make it so much more digestible. Daphne, what's one thing you'd love to leave the audience with tonight?
Sorry, you were breaking up.
Oh, what was one thing you'd like to leave with the audience tonight?
I think the thing that I'd like to leave with the audience is we each are uniquely and wonderfully made human beings. And I love Jen's point about we should see the human being in the other person, and also to relish who we are, leverage that as a part of our superpower, but also to give that grace to other people, to understand and to look for the positives. It may sound a little Pollyanna, but I think when we recognize that most human beings are just trying to do the best they can, um, we are in an environment now where people are in a constant state of trigger. This whole idea of an amygdala hijack, people are living it every single day. And so it's up to each one of us to figure out how to engage in a different way that builds trust, that empowers and connects people. And so I write a lot about neuroscience and the idea of trust and belonging and the chemicals that go into that. And what I want people to be able to understand is we each have something special to offer, but we also have to understand that in this crazy environment, people are coming in with all kinds of issues and all kinds of things going on that have nothing to do with us. And so if we can learn how to communicate more effectively, to de-escalate as opposed to escalate, I'm hoping that people will find some truth in just figuring out how to be themselves and let other people be themselves as well.
I love that. I hear authenticity. I hear understanding, embracing others, and I hear empathy. And one of my favorite stories in my book, it's a subtitle of a chapter called "Empathy is His Superpower," and it's about a gentleman I've known for years, and he's actually an interior designer. And the level of understanding this gentleman takes to his clients, to his employees, is just, I've never seen anything like it in my life. And in fact, in doing so, it's actually made his business just accelerate like crazy. And I don't think he set out to be empathetic to try to grow his business. It's just how he is and how he thinks about things and how he leads his company. And the results have just been extraordinary. So I think if I was going to leave one thought on the table, I think it might be sort of borrowing from both of you and saying, yeah, let's understand that there's other people involved in this conversation. It may not be easy, but if we have these conversations and put ourselves out there and be a bit vulnerable and authentic, I think we're going to find ourselves in a better place. So thank you for sharing those stories. So with that, Melissa, maybe we could open up and see if we have any questions in the queue that we could address from the audience.
Oh, I see a good one.
Mm-hmm.
What is something you learned that surprised you in writing this book?
Mm-hmm.
Daphne, what did you learn that surprised you?
I think I was doing some research around this whole idea of amygdala hijacking and triggering. And, I think we've all had experiences where we've lost it. And one of the things that surprised me is how to help somebody who is being triggered. We think we can speak rationally and logically to people when they're upset. And that part of the brain shuts down when people are triggered or they feel disrespected or they're feeling unsafe. They are not thinking logically. So us attacking them with logic only escalates the situation. And so there are tricks to de-escalate that are very, very helpful. And they actually work in getting people, as Jen said, to step away from the trigger and to start to really calm down, and then they can start to be more logical.
Yeah,
Jen,
facts
you
are
want to
not
take
your friend. Well, I think when you get into a difficult conversation, and this surprised me as well, especially when we think about politics, facts are not your friend when you're in an emotional conversation. And so I've had a lot of people ask me, well, how do we talk about politics? And the reality is, you can bring facts to the table, but that's a conversation about who you are as a person and your identity. And anytime we question someone's identity, whether it's feedback at work or whatever, that's extremely scary. And people buckle down because they want to survive that, or they might go into fight mode. And so it's extremely important to help people feel safe. And one of the phrases that that I'll use, especially if we're talking about politics or something else, because I do love a good hard conversation. I'll say, listen, I'm actually not here to change your mind. I'm not. I just want to learn and listen. And once you set the goal and the stage of that conversation and set expectations and still stay calm, which can sometimes be hard, that makes a huge difference. And so understanding, to Daphne's point, the brain, and specifically for politics and even talking with family, just taking a deep breath to help interrupt yourself, because you can only control you. You can't control what someone else is doing. So I practice every day, especially being home, like doing homework with kids and everything. Take a deep breath, stay calm, right? The bigger picture is protect the relationship. So it's okay to step back and just press pause. But there were a lot of things I learned as I went through it. I thought I was good at communicating, and I'm decent. But difficult conversation is a whole nother level of skill.
Here comes a question.
You should take this one. As an author, how do you define success? You're an author too. We're all Georgetown authors. Yeah. We got to hear from you.
I love it. How do I define success as an author? I think one, finishing the book. I could tell you this, there were definitely two dark days during this last year where I thought, I'm out.
Oh yeah, tap out.
I can't do it anymore. I can't take it anymore. And, so certainly that, but I would also add to that this just being part of this community, this new network that I've been entered into, it's just, I've literally met people all over the world. And that part of this, just in researching my book, because it has, one of the things that I found, sort of back to this surprise thing, was that I originally started out with this book in my industry. I spent many years in financial services working on Wall Street, and that was my original target audience. And as I began to research further and further, I realized these lessons about leadership and creating this mindset of constant innovation or optimization, these are universal lessons. So, I've made friendships with some folks in China throughout this research, a couple of folks in Europe, South America. It's been just unbelievable to see how far the messages could go. So when I think about success for this book, it's been just blowing up my network, meeting all these interesting new people, and letting my curiosity lead the way, and seeing just great things come out of that, and some new relationships in terms of starting a coaching business. It's been great.
Ooh, this was for Daphne to start for sure. What are some tips on how to promote authenticity in the workplace?
I think the best way to promote authenticity is for you to be yourself. And it doesn't mean yourself on a Saturday afternoon at home. I think sometimes people think that, this is who I am. I think in the workplace, it should be the best version of yourself, not the perfect person, but also be willing to be as vulnerable as it is safe for you to do so. I think Jen talked about this idea of psychological safety is a real thing. And Brené Brown talks about people cannot be vulnerable when they don't feel safe. And so particularly for leaders, it's our job to set the environment and make sure that that environment is safe for people to be themselves. It doesn't mean that we all get along and sing Kumbaya. To Jen's point, there are times when difficult conversations need to happen. But to be authentic, there has to be trust. And what that means is, as leaders, we have to do what we say we're going to do. And when we make mistakes, we have to be willing to admit we make mistakes, and to learn and to grow, and to bring people into community with the understanding that success looks like everybody winning. It's not this idea of a Hunger Games where there can be only one. It's about establishing an environment where people feel safe enough to be themselves.
Yeah, it's never a zero-sum game, is it? And sometimes we can get caught in that trap. I really appreciate you saying that. Melissa, any other questions in the queue, or should we start to wind down here? We're getting close to the top of the hour.
I want to,
The bottom, I
while
should say.
Melissa's getting a question, I want to go back to, and this may be the wrap up. When I think about success as an author, what I would share, and I loved what you said, John, and I think that's, this year definitely, we published the book, and there's still a whole lot of marketing to do and stuff like that. When I think about why I wrote the book or why anyone would write a book, I think there are 5 reasons. You're either writing the book as part of a cathartic exercise for yourself to get it out of you and on paper. And it might just be a book that you don't care if anybody reads it, but you need to get it on paper. I think you could write a book just to educate, which is a bit more of an academic book, but it is an educational piece. There's a piece around starting a movement, right? I mean, our goal is to drive change for some authors. I think for the 3 of us, we want people to think differently, act differently, behave differently. You might write a book to speak. Maybe, I mean, I could see anybody and on this call up on a stage talking about their book. Definitely, I could definitely see someone dropping the mask in 2021. I know we're going to see that on the TED Talk. And then, you're not really writing a book to make money. That's not one of the things that happens. that might come from speaking and like other stuff, but you don't sell 100,000 copies on day one. So I think as an author, it's important to think about, why are you writing the book? It could be all of those reasons, but go into it with a plan past publishing your book and like, what do you want the next 12 months to be? How do you keep the dialogue and the conversation going? How do you want people to learn from the book, and what does that look like? So when I think about success for an author, every author's answer may be different, but those tend to be the buckets to think about: educate, speak, inspire, start a movement, or maybe it's just a cathartic thing, or maybe it's a few of those or all of them. But it can be helpful to think about that because it might change what you write or how you write it.
And how you go about the journey.
Yes.
Right, or said about the journey. That's fantastic. Any last questions in the queue, Melissa, or should we start to wrap up?
Know the winners of our book drawing.
Aha.
So for anybody who registered on Eventbrite, each of the authors, so thank you to John and Daphne, we all ponied up a book for our audience. So Melissa, if you can, and Melissa from Rescue Event Planning is like behind the scenes wizard. And so she's making all this happen, all these fancy things popping up on the screen. So Catherine won the optimizer. So she'll get a signed copy. Dropping the Mask, John Thompson. So we'll make sure that everybody gets their mask. We'll reach out afterwards via email. And then Sleek Talbot, yay, got a copy of my book. So we'll reach out to all of our winners via email, look for something from us tomorrow, and figure out how to get you a copy. When you get it, take a picture, post it online, or just, email us a selfie with it. That would be awesome. You don't have to, but if you feel like it, we would love it.
That would be fantastic. So I just want to let everybody know our books are out there. They're available online wherever you buy books, Barnes & Noble, well, certainly Amazon, Barnes & Noble, wherever you might buy books online. I really hope you enjoyed the show and felt like you got a bit of a glimpse into a front row seat of what it's like going through the creative journey and of writing a book, and not just writing a book, but publishing a book. They're 2 very different things, aren't they?
John, where can people find you to ask questions or follow you?
Sure. The best place to find me is my handle on most social media sites is JCS, my initials, _optimizer. Dun, dun, dun.
Daphne, how about for you? How can people find you?
Probably the best way is on LinkedIn, linkedin.com/n/Daphne Jefferson.
And all of our books are on Amazon and other channels too. Thank you so much, John, for diving in and hosting us and asking all these great questions. And I'm so excited to get your book. And Daphne, thank you so much. I'm totally have a crush on the topic you're writing and on you. I think it's so powerful, and it's what we need right now for authenticity and leadership. If anybody wants to connect with me, at Brand Mirror on Facebook and Twitter, I'm on Instagram as well. And then definitely reach out on LinkedIn. We would love to make sure you get copies of our books for the holidays, and just spread the message. We put a lot of time and effort in to try to make a difference. So let us know what you think and just reach out and connect. Thank you again, everybody, for joining us. And for anybody who's tuning in tomorrow, I will be talking with Diane Falk at noon. Same bat time, same bat channel. You can find it live on YouTube for Brand Mirror and also for Facebook. So thank you again for joining us. Stay authentic, have some empathy, start practicing some of these difficult conversations, and think about who you want to be as a leader in 2021. Talk to you tomorrow.